Welcome to another installment of Donning the Armor. This morning we will begin in Numbers chapter 19, verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, This is the ordinance of the law which the Lord has commanded, saying, Speak to the children of Israel that they bring you a red heifer without blemish, in which there is no defect, and on which a yoke has never come. All right, so now we're going to get to the law and ordinance of the red heifer, which is interesting because this is now an ordinance and a law being given post-Sinai, outside of the book of Leviticus, outside of Exodus, outside of the foot of Mount Sinai. They have already begun traveling. So it's interesting that this is now coming up. And I've heard some different things on this, but just from a complete reading of the text, the red heifer is one of those things where there's lots of crazy prophecy people that look to this and will say, hey, Israel's found the red heifer. The whole world's coming to an end. The end times are here. Well, the end times have been here for 2,000 years. Just all right. Like, we're in the end of days. Like, it's already come. We're just awaiting the return of Christ. Like, we're already there. But the idea of the red heifer, the reason people assign this prophetic nature to it and really kind of go a little crazy and overboard with it is because it will be used for consecration and ceremonial cleansing. And people think if they find a red heifer now that meets these requirements, then the Jews can go back to sacrificing. Now, there are plenty of issues with that. One, we're told in Revelation that the sacrifices will not come back again until the Antichrist comes back and allows it, because there's going to be no sacrificing at the temple because the Temple Mount is controlled by Muslims. And they will murder any Jew that would even attempt to sacrifice an animal up there. So there's a whole lot of issues with that. But the idea of the red heifer is that they would be able to cleanse the instruments, be able to cleanse and restart the priesthood, and begin the sacrifices again because they will be cleansed by the ashes of the red heifer. Now, let's get to see what it actually just says in Numbers outside of the prophetic, outside of the prophecy of future. Because by the time that comes, the rapture should have already happened, and it won't matter for me anyway. But there's some interesting things because this red heifer has some things that are going to be very different from any other sacrifice. And it's got some requirements that make it very difficult to come upon one. And it's been estimated that, and I don't know how they came up with this number anyway, but commentators have come up with the idea that there was probably only 6 or 7 red heifers ever sacrificed throughout the entire history of Israel, because it was so rare to have one that met all of these requirements. So you had to have a red heifer. So you had to have a female cow, which is never bred, because a heifer is a female who's never had a child. Is a cow that's never had a child. So now it needs to be red. So it needs to be a ginger cow. You don't see them very often. It's more like scarlet, but you get the idea. Without blemish. Now, this isn't just without broken bones, without defects. This is also without a single hair that isn't red. So it can't have a couple of white hairs mixed in and no, it needs to be a complete red heifer. No defect, no blemish, and it could never have had a yoke placed on it, meaning it could never have worked a field ever. So with all those requirements, it makes finding any one red heifer incredibly difficult. So, God continuing, you shall give it to Eleazar the priest, that he may take it outside the camp, and it shall be slaughtered before him. So unlike the other sacrifices, This is not being sacrificed. This is being slaughtered. It's not being done at the tabernacle. It's being done outside the camp. And it's not being done by the priest or the high priest. It's being done in front of the priest. And Eleazar the priest shall take some of its blood with his finger and sprinkle some of its blood 7 times directly in front of the tabernacle of meeting. So he'll take some of its blood and shake it in front of the tabernacle. Then the heifer shall be burned in his sight. So Eleazar will take it back to the tabernacle, shake his finger 7 times, then go back outside the camp, and it will be burned in front of his sight. Its hide, its flesh, its blood, which is interesting because if you remember from most of the sacrifices, they bleed the animal first on the side of the altar and then burn it. This is being burned with the blood, and with its offal it shall be burned. And the priest shall take cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet and cast them into the midst of the fire, burning the heifer. So now it's also taking these ingredients which we saw used to purify and make clean the leper, and now it's being thrown on top of what is being burnt with the heifer. Then the priest shall wash his clothes, he shall bathe in water, and afterward he shall come into the camp. The priest shall be unclean until evening, and the one who burns it shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and shall be unclean until evening. Then a man who is clean, so now the one who burned it and the priest, they're unclean. So now you need to find a third person who is clean, and he's going to go up and gather up the ashes of the heifer and store them outside the camp in a clean place. And they shall be kept for the congregation of the children of Israel for the water of purification. It is for purifying from sin. So now you have a third person. He's going to go and gather up all these ashes and store them in a container. Now, it is believed by some that there actually are still ashes of a red heifer in the world today. That because of the containers they kept in, that they would survive the heat, and that they are hidden somewhere, and that there are some that would have survived. Now, the idea is because of the cedar wood, because of the size of the cow, and because of how sparingly they used the ashes. It's not like when they went to a water purification, they dumped like in a cup of ashes in there. They'd sprinkle the ashes in. So each time they would burn a heifer, they would have an absolute abundance of ashes that they would now be gathering up. And then they'd be using it sparingly throughout the years. So that's the thought. True or not, who knows? And the one who gathers the ashes of the heifer shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. It shall be a statute forever to the children of Israel and to the stranger who dwells among them. So the idea is any time you find a red heifer, this is what you would do. Then you would gather up the ashes. Now, it's going to be incredibly rare, so that's why they use them sparingly, because you might not see a red heifer for 100 years. So that's the idea. He who touches the dead body of anyone shall be unclean 7 days. He shall purify himself with the water on the 3rd day, and on the 7th day, then he shall be clean. So I've heard some people try to mention this idea that this water purification was almost a cheat code, that you didn't have to go through the normal cleansing process that has been prescribed in Leviticus, and that you would only need to sprinkle yourself with this water and then you'd be clean at evening. But that's not really what this says straight out. It's saying that you touch a dead body, you shall be unclean for 7 days, and you will purify yourself with this water. What they'll do is they'll take water and they'll sprinkle just a little bit of the ashes in it, and then you'll purify yourself on the 3rd and 7th day. So you're still being out there for 7 days. You're not coming in before the 7 days. It's just now there's an added thing to how you need to clean. You're going to use this water purification. And it seems to only be used when people come in contact with dead bodies, not really to be made clean from anything else. But if he does not purify himself on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, he will not be clean. So if you're not using this water, you're not going to be clean. So this is in addition to something they had to do before. This is a further explanation of what's happening. Not so much this is a way to get out of doing what was done and what was commanded in the past. Because if you don't use the water purification with the ash of the red heifer, you don't get to be clean, period. Whoever touches the body of anyone who has died and does not purify himself defiles the tabernacle of the Lord. That person shall be cut off from Israel. He shall be unclean because the water of purification was not sprinkled on him. His uncleanness is still on him. So if he doesn't purify himself, then he defiles the tabernacle of the Lord. Meaning he is actively acting out in defiance of a command of the Lord. So he's defiling the tabernacle of the Lord. He's making the commands of the Lord empty. He's making his servitude of the Lord in vain. He's making it empty. The Lord is saying you must use this water of purification or you're unclean, period, and you need to be cut off from Israel. This is the law when a man dies in a tent. All who come into the tent and all who are in the tent shall be unclean 7 days. And every open vessel which has no cover fastened on it is unclean. Whoever in the open field touches one who is slain by a sword or who has died, or the bone of a man or a grave shall be unclean 7 days. So this is expressing all the questions that the Israelites may have about, okay, well, what happens if somebody dies and, we have to go clean out their tent? You're unclean for 7 days. What happens, and we've already gone over in Leviticus the rules for when a vessel's broken, if it was something that could be washed, it's washed. If it's something that held food or water, it needs to just be broken and just replaced. But it's also saying whoever touches somebody who's slain with a sword. So in war, you pick up your brethren, you bring them back to be buried. You're now unclean for 7 days. This is what needs to happen to be ritually cleaned again. As I mentioned during the reading of Leviticus and stuff, a lot of this is just public safety. This is public health policy, basically. And for an unclean person, they shall take some of the ashes of the heifer burnt for the purification from sin, and running water shall be put on them in a vessel. A clean person shall take hyssop and dip it in the water, sprinkle it on the tent, in all the vessels, on the persons who were there, and on the one who touched a bone, the slain, the dead, or a grave. The clean person shall sprinkle the unclean on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, and on the 7th day he shall purify himself, wash his clothes, and bathe in water, and at evening he shall be clean. So, here you go. You're going to dip it in the hyssop. You're going to sprinkle it. You're going to sprinkle it on the tent. You're going to sprinkle it on all the vessels that are closed. You're going to sprinkle it on the people who are there. And this is how you're going to become clean again based on this water of purification. You're going to take some of the ashes. You're going to put water in them in the vessel. You're going to do this. But the man who is unclean and does not purify himself, that person shall be cut off from among the assembly because he has defiled the sanctuary of the Lord. The water of purification has not been sprinkled on him. He is unclean. It shall be a perpetual statute for them. He who sprinkles the water of purification shall wash his clothes, and he who touches the water of purification shall be unclean until evening. Whatever the unclean person touches shall be unclean, and the person who touches it shall be unclean until evening. Same basic rules we've had before. That these ashes of the heifer are going to be used with water to now make a water purification to sprinkle on people as a way to make them ritually clean from all the uncleanliness that we've already covered in previous chapters. And that's the reason why they have all the predictions and all of the prophecies of people looking out to this day for red heifers, because they believe that as soon as they find one, everything will be back in line for the end times to really start ramping up. I wouldn't worry about it too much because, as with everything when it comes to the end times, it'll happen when the Lord chooses for it to happen. We can't worry about any of that. It'll happen when it happens. When it does happen, great. I look forward to those days because I would love to be in the presence of the Lord. But I'm not going to go crazy over worrying about who's seen a ginger cow. So, moving on to chapter 20. Then the children of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. So now we come to an interesting chapter, because when you read this, you got to understand that this now is the final year. We're told in Scripture that Miriam, Aaron, and Moses all die in the same year. So now the wandering of the children of Israel has come to a close. The entire old generation has now died off. This is now the new generation. The old 40 years of wandering people, they have all died off. This is now their children. They have now come to the wilderness of Zin at Kadesh. They have now come to the age where they are now going to go into and take the land. There's still some trials they got to get over. There's still some preparation. But this is where the final year before they go into the land begins. And here we see Miriam, the first of the three to die. They come here. She is a very old woman. And now she passes away. But then we get to the children of Israel, this second generation, coming out of Egypt, following in the same footsteps of the first generation, having been raised with the bitterness and the rebellion of their parents. They now fall into the same stumbling that their parents did. Now there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and Aaron, and the people contended with Moses, saying, "If only we had died when our brethren died before the Lord. If only we had died walking through the wilderness as the rest of our brethren had, as our parents did." I mean, that's a statement right there. That once again, they have learned so well from the complaining of their parents that if only we had died when the rest of us died, why did we have to continue on? Why have you brought up the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness that we and our animals should die here? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there any water to drink. So now you have the children complaining in the same way their fathers did. Bring us up out of Egypt. Everyone in the last 40 years was cursed to wander and die if they were less than 20 years old. Which means 2 years prior to that, they were in Egypt. Which means everyone here complaining was either not born yet or was at most 18 years old. They barely experienced Egypt. But now they call this place evil. And in a way, it's hard to blame them, because they did just spend their entire formative and adult years wandering in the wilderness, watching their parents and grandparents die in front of them. I mean, this is a place of death to them, this wilderness. This is not the land of milk and honey that they were promised, that their parents were promised. But that's because they didn't heed the word of God and go into that land of milk and honey. They chose to stay. They chose to rebel. And they paid for their rebellion. It'll say later in Numbers. Lest your sin find you out. Do the things of the Lord, lest your sin find you out. Because so often in the Old Testament, we view God as this authoritative dictator and vengeful God who kills off these disobedient children of Israel. But so often, it is just the consequences of their own sin. There are natural consequences to our actions and behaviors. They lived in rebellion. They wanted to be rebellious to the Lord, and the Lord allowed it. He said, I've brought you to the promised land, but you don't want to go in? You don't have to. And they wandered until they died. They could have gone in. They could have taken their inheritance right then and there, but they chose not to. So they view this as an evil place. But it's an evil place brought on to them by the wickedness of their own parents and grandparents. So Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and they fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together, speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring the water out for them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation and their animals. So Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him. So Moses, Aaron, they go to the Lord, say, Lord, what are we going to do with these people? They're doing this again. And the Lord said, take that rod of Aaron that has blossomed, that ripe almond-bearing rod. Take it before the congregation to that rock. Speak to it. Speak to that boulder, and it will yield its water. Speak to it, and it will bring forth living water for you, so that the congregation may drink of it, so that the animals may drink of it, and have their thirst sated. So Moses takes the rod from the tabernacle. He does as the Lord commands him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock. And he said to them, Hear now, you rebels. Must we bring water for you out of this rock? Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. And water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. I don't remember any of that being said by the Lord. Moses told the meekest man, but meek doesn't mean weak. It doesn't even mean lacking in violence. It means somebody who's able to humble themselves before the Lord. But Moses, as we know, has always kind of had an anger issue. He killed an Egyptian in cold blood. He broke the first 10 commandments, the 2 tablets, out of anger. And here, he has been pushed so far. He has just been forced, as they were, to wander for 40 years instead of entering into the promised land because of their rebellion. And now he's probably looking at this again, saying, we are coming here again. We are so close to entering the promised land, and you're going to cause us to wander again. So now he yells out that they're rebels. And it says, Must we bring water for you out of this rock? Must Moses and Aaron bring water out of this rock? And then he struck the rock twice with his rod. He was told to speak to it, and he strikes it twice. You know, we are told that this rock that followed them from camp to camp as they moved was Jesus. That this was the blessing of Christ to bring forth living water. And once Christ was struck down for them to bring forth water. Because it was once that Christ would be crucified for us. Christ doesn't need to be re-crucified every time we sin. Christ isn't still hanging on that cross like some denominations like to keep him. Christ doesn't need to be re-struck for us to drink from the living water that flows from him in abundance. We need just speak to him. We need simply speak to him. The veil has been torn. We don't need someone else. We don't need something to happen. We don't need to re-crucify him. We need to just turn to our Father. Turn to our bridegroom and speak to him. Lord, I need your living water in my life. I need a refreshing from you because I thirst for you. I thirst for you once again. But you notice, Moses does nothing that the Lord tells him to do. He speaks harshly. He strikes the rock. He takes credit for the work of God. He makes the Lord look irreverent in the eyes of the congregation. But still, the water came out in abundance. Even with Moses doing everything wrong he could possibly do, that water still came out in abundance. That water still came out abundantly, and the congregation still drank of it, because God still blesses us in abundance, even in our sin. We're to repent and turn to him. But he still blesses us because his love for us is that much greater. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel, to make him holy and separate and just place him above all else, to praise him in the eyes of the children of Israel. Therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. And it's interesting because clearly the Lord knew this was going to happen. Because as we were told, the Lord said only 2 people, 2 from this generation will go into the promised land. Only 2 from 20 years old and above will go into the promised land. Caleb and Joshua. Moses wasn't mentioned. Aaron wasn't mentioned. Miriam weren't mentioned. So the Lord knew there'd come a time when Moses would remove himself from the equation, unfortunately. The Lord knows what we're going to choose because he is the end and the beginning. Everything is the present to him. At the end of days, at the end of time, into eternity, he is either with us or not with us. So he knows what we chose. He sees everything. He experiences everything unfold. We only experience the present, so we have decisions to make. But he knows what decisions we're going to make. Doesn't negate our ability to decide just because he knows what we're going to decide. So he knew the decision Moses would make and where he would go wrong. This was the water of Meribah, because the children of Israel contended with the Lord, and he was hallowed among them. Now Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom. Remember, this is actually, Edom is the people descended from Esau, so the twin brother of Jacob. Thus says your brother Israel, you know all the hardship that has befallen us. How our fathers went down to Egypt, And we dwelt in Egypt a long time, and the Egyptians afflicted us and our fathers. When we cried out to the Lord, he heard our voice and sent the angel and brought us up out of Egypt. Now here we are in Kadesh, a city on the edge of your border. Please let us pass through your country. We will not pass through fields or vineyards, nor will we drink water from wells. We will go along the king's highway. We will not turn aside to the right hand or to the left until we have passed through your territory. So he's saying, we are distant cousins. You know all that's transpired. Can we please come through your land by way of the king's highway, which was a actual highway that went through a couple of different nations. It was basically the main thoroughfare, saying we're not going to go through vineyards, we're not going to go through fields, we'll stick to this, and we're just quickly going to go through your territory. That's all we're going to do. You know everything, you know our history. Then Edom said to him, you shall not pass through my land, lest I come out against you with the sword. So the children of Israel said to him, we will go by the highway, or if I or my livestock drink any of your water, then I will pay for it. Let me only pass through on foot, nothing more. Then he said, you shall not pass through. So Edom came out against them with many men and with a strong hand. Thus Edom refused to give Israel passage through his territory, so Israel turned away from him. So they said, look, please let us go through. We will, like we said, we won't touch anything. And Edom has refused. So it comes to a passage where it says, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. And people say, see, before they were ever born, God chose to love one and hate the other. Predestination, election. God has created people that he will hate for all eternity, and they have no choice whether they are loved or hated. Or God is wholly just, wholly loving, and he allows us to make our own decisions. And in this, Edom, which is Esau, as Israel is Jacob, rebels against him at every chance. Esau sold his birthright. Esau was a man who lived for worldly satisfaction. Edom refuses and is willing to go to war with God's chosen people in defiance of him. Yes, it is repeated in the Old Testament through Psalms and many other places that if you are not for God, you are against him, and he hates those who are against him. You are an enemy to the Lord. Edom was an enemy to the Lord because they made themselves an enemy to the Lord. So yes, he hated them because that is what they wanted. Could you imagine that probably wouldn't even been written? Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. If Edom had loved God and welcomed in their brethren. He said, your brother Israel, your brother nation. If they said, oh no, you are our brethren. Come on. Come into our land. Go through. You are welcome. How much different it would have been. But they had hardened their hearts and turned away from the Lord and turned away from their brethren. So yeah, Jacob he loved and Esau he hated. Because that's what they each wanted. Israel wanted to, in their imperfect way, be the children of God. Edom wanted to be their own man. Now the children of Israel, the whole congregation, journeyed from Kadesh and came to Mount Hor. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in Mount Hor by the border of the land of Edom, saying, Aaron shall be gathered to his people, for he shall not enter the land which I have given to the children of Israel, because you have rebelled against my word at the water of Meribah. Take Aaron and Eleazar his son, and bring them up to Mount Hor, and strip Aaron of his garments, and put them on Eleazar his son. For Aaron shall be gathered to his people and die there. So Moses did just as the Lord commanded, and they went up to Mount Hor in the sight of all the congregation. Moses stripped Aaron of his garments and put them on Eleazar his son, and Aaron died there on the top of the mountain. Then Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain. Now when all the congregation saw that Aaron was dead, all the house of Israel mourned for Aaron 30 days. Aaron was no less guilty of the sin at Meribah than Moses was. The Lord had spoken to both of them, and they both did not act in the way that they should. Aaron, an old man. But the Lord wanted to make preparations. He said, this is where you're going to go in and be gathered to your people, which is just to say he's going to die. There is some thought that this also means being gathered into Abraham's bosom, which would be kind of a more blessed way of going to Sheol. Don't really know. It could just be a poetic way of saying it. Kind of the way we have words like, well, he died or he passed on. But it's interesting that the Lord is showing the entire congregation that the high priesthood is now moved from Aaron to his son Eleazar. And that now it's going to be Eleazar as your high priest. And basically, there's an entire new generation being set up, a leadership being set up, as this new generation is preparing to go into the promised land. That the old has passed away and that the new is now going to move forward. It's sad to see the old go. We don't like to see change. But if we look at the nation of Israel as we are to look at ourselves, when we move from sin to salvation, we are to cast off the old man and become reborn anew and move forth in our Christian walk a new creation, a new person. And as this congregation of Israel is passing on and the old is passing away, the new is now taking up and will go in and walking out the walk of the Lord. See, some people see going into the promised land as going into heaven, but it's not, because there are giants in the promised land. Promised land is more going into the walk of a Christian, going into that Christian walk, going into that process of sanctification as we walk through this world. Because as there's battles in the promised land, there are battles that we will face as we go through a Christian walk. And we will cast off the old man. And for some of us, it's harder to cast off that old man. We miss that old man. We don't want to see the old man be cast off, but they must be cast off for the new to walk the way they need to walk. Here we see Aaron, who, for all of his faults, was a faithful servant for 4 decades, not being able to enter the promised land. We'll see Moses, 4 decades as a faithful servant of the Lord, not getting to experience the promised land. Because the new needs to walk, needs to prosper, and needs to battle their way to the promises of the Lord. We need to do the same. We need to walk out and battle for every step we take so that we can glorify the Lord in the way He deserves to be glorified. Casting off that old man and walking out as a new one. But anyway, that's where we shall end it for today. I hope this was fruitful for you. I hope to see you again next time. But until then, be blessed.